But today we're looking at Job 28. Job is the first of the 5 poetical books that come in the Old Testament. It's a book that deals with the problem of, as I'm sure you know, great suffering. Job is probably, we believe, the oldest book we have in our Bibles, written in the time of the patriarchs, the first patriarchs. And being an old book, it deals with an old problem, does it not? The oldest problem in the world. Years ago, people didn't really understand the problem of suffering, and today it's much the same. Job is the story of a righteous man who suffered the loss of his wealth, health, and family. And his friends come and he discusses with them the possible reasons for his sufferings. Good old friend Trevor Knight, in his introduction to this book, once wrote, Job did not find the answer to what he was asking, but by the end of the book, he had lost his questions. Do you know, in that one brief sentence, as Trevor certainly often can, he summed up for us a great deal of what this ancient story is really all about. Job goes on to realize that godly people still have to trust the will of God all the time, even when we can't trace the hand of God in the things that are happening. And although the book takes us behind the scenes, so to speak, to indicate some of the happenings in the heavenly realms, as far as Job was concerned for much of the book, the reason for his suffering is sealed up in the silence of God, which is a hard thing. Now, much of the book of Job, it's a long book, consists of cycles of speeches. In fact, 3 cycles of speeches from Job and his friends, repeating these so-called comforting friends. And when you read those chapters, it's hard going. There is often much bluster, many words, and empty philosophy given to us. People speaking dark words in the darkness. No help at all. Nevertheless, the Bible records these words. Note this, the Bible isn't shy and doesn't hold back from recording error as being truth that we can learn from. Isn't that interesting? The Bible is infallible even when it records things that are not right that people say. God's gracious, isn't he? So Job at times thought that God was unkind. He's not, but he thought it. His friends make the mistake of suggesting that Job was being punished for his sins. He wasn't, but they said it. And these things were faithfully recorded. Why? To show that man is fallible in his thinking and in his reasoning. In the end, Job proved to be his best comforter, and a best comforter for all who are suffering, because his trials and his triumphs have comforted thousands down through the years since this book was written. I trust this book can help us today. This chapter even, which you may have thought was an odd chapter to read, chapter 28. This is a chapter I feel that is very helpful to anyone who, like Job, is found asking this question: why will God not answer my question? Job 28 helps us with that question. By the time we get to Job 28, Job has been wrestling with this urgent existential question. He's been crying out to God, why? 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 Now, of course, this question isn't a simple question, even though it's very short. It's not the simple question of any cheap religious armchair philosopher, as we've said. We can do without them. on days like this. This is an agonized question of a true sufferer. Someone who really does need answers. Now, you may know that leading up to this chapter, there's been this insight into the heavenly council chamber, chapters 1 and 2, where God has given or allowed Satan to test Job within certain constraints. And then, after suffering great calamities, we've had these long cycles of debates, as I say, arguments ebbing and flowing between Job and his so-called friends. By the time you get to 28, this cycle of arguments seems to have ground to a halt. Words have failed, and silence has descended. There's an embarrassed silence, almost, when you get to this chapter. And what chapter 28 does, it allows us to step back, and we have an opportunity, away from the painful cries and the noisy debates, to focus and to think and to ask, why is it that God will not answer this great question of Job? Why? So here in the midst of deep anguish and lecturing in life lessons stands Job 28. And it's an unusual chapter. It's a unique chapter in the book. It is not certain who is speaking in Job 28. Let's say that to begin with. Some Bible versions seem to give the impression that it is Job continuing, but we can't be certain from the Hebrew text whether he is speaking or not. What this chapter definitely is different to all that surrounds it, because it is a poetic interlude into these debates and these discussions. It has a different tone from all that surrounds it. You'll note, if you've read up to that point, it has no direct connection with what's been said before. It has no complaints, accusations, or responses to what's been said before. It stands alone. It stands alone. And it has a more reflective air than what's gone before. It's a contemplative pause for thought. And maybe that's what we need right now. So I want to look at this poem this morning briefly and maybe find how it might help to contribute to our understanding of what can be a difficult and troubling book. So let's look at these verses. I want to take them like this first. You can look on the wall or look in your Bible. It's up to you. Here are verses 1 to 11. And in verses 1 to 11, there is a costly search described for valuable treasure. It begins with no explanation. It invites us on a tour. And we're invited on a tour to look at marvels of this world. In fact, we're given a mining tour, an exploration of mining. Seems bizarre. Two themes emerge in these verses. On the one hand, there are precious objects of great value. They're listed there for us. But alongside that, in these verses, there is also the search for something that is difficult, in fact, impossible. A search of great difficulty and cost is put alongside these objects of great treasure and value. That's what the poet is doing in these verses 1 to 11. Think about the miner, says the poet. He's got an immensely dangerous and difficult job, but it's worth it, for the objects of his search are of such wonderful value. The mine we see is presented as being a deep place, a mysterious, dark place, full of puzzles and perplexities, something you can't fathom easily. But listen, it appears that there are valuable things that have been placed deliberately in this hard to access and traverse place. And this suggests that somebody has deliberately put valuable things in such a way that they are hard to find. But they are worth finding nonetheless. And that might alert us or even remind us once again of Job's great longing, of course, and of how as he says in chapter 23, verse 3, if only I knew where to find him, that is God. If only I knew how to find him. And so as we can read here, this search is a lonely search. It's a dangerous search, it would appear. It's a difficult search because these precious jewels are not easy to locate and not easy to extract and bring home. It's a picture of Job's longing for answers in his search. This question, why? Now let me ask you a question now, a why question. Why has the poet led us, drawn us into this search and caused us to meditate upon its necessity and its cost today? Well, he gives an answer in verse 12, and it's the next set of verses I want to put on the wall, verses 12 onwards. Because now this poem about mining runs parallel in the natural world with a greater and a deeper search, the search for wisdom, you note. Now, we might be forgiven for thinking that the book of Job is primarily about arguments and philosophies and debates, and many chapters give us cause to think that. But really, that's not the case. Perhaps even a unique chapter like this is the key to what this book is all about. I think this chapter helps to unlock the book of Job, in fact, for us all. In fact, it's a chapter like no other because what we find in the book of Job truly is there's a search of a believing sufferer for wisdom in this world, a longing to understand why and how this world is the way it is. And Job 28 helps us unlock that door to find what we need. And so the poet moves now to a meditation on this most deeply frustrating tension in Job's existence. We are invited not to be philosophers and thinkers and debaters. We are invited to be life's honest seekers, searching after wisdom. But what Job discovers is that though he might long for an answer to the question why, he will discover that it may not be found. You understand that? What he searches for, he may not actually discover. That's a blow, isn't it? And hard to take in. You see, just as verses 1 to 11 showed us how jewels were both priceless and yet inaccessible, perhaps, verses 12 to 22 similarly interweave that theme of how wisdom, which is both of great value, is also unobtainable to us. That's the frustration of life. With great vigour, the poet presses home how desperate mankind may be to know how the world works. And a suffering person, most of all, wants to know that. And if any search is worth pursuing, it must be this. Why? Why, God? If only Job or any believer could gain access to this understanding, then surely that answer would be known. And why, for Job, all this has happened to him. He would no longer, he thinks, be suffering in the dark. But wisdom for ourselves, note, wisdom purely for ourselves cannot be found, we read. Wisdom for ourselves, on our terms, cannot be discovered. It can't be bought, says the poet, with all the precious jewels in the world. And in this eloquent poetry, motivation is piled upon motivation to pursue the search, and yet we know from earlier verses the search is bound to fail, for wisdom is not to be found in the land of the living, verse 13, nor even in the deep, verse 14. So, what are we to do? Where are we to go? Well, finally, verses 20 to 22, we see the poet dumping Job, and us perhaps, back on the ash heap of frustration where he started. Now, what has the poet done to him? What has the poet done to us? Friends, I think he has given us cause for pause and cause for true thought this morning in the midst of life's great crises. We've been shown the great tension that exists in life, one that prevails for all who are caught up in terrible human dramas which arise. Is Job right in his longing to know the answer to his question? Yes, of course he is. But will his search perhaps fail? Yes, it might. He can and he must seek wisdom, but Job may never find it. Now, on the ash heap of frustration, if that's where the poem ended, we would be in a terrible place. If verse 22 was the ending of chapter 28, it would be the theatre of the absurd where we've come to. Poetry of pure despair that we're thinking about this morning. But this poem does not end in verse 22. Thank God for that. For here, just these last few verses from verse 23 to 28, the poet and the poem offers us a paradoxical but also a profound and humbling resolution to all that we might have been considering right now. Look at these verses and take in what is to be the conclusion to all our searching. The voice of the poet has sung the praises of wisdom. He's extolled the value of understanding, but he's also lamented the utter inescapability of gaining these things. So, where shall it be found, he asks. Where is the place of understanding? Well, he half answers his own question in verse 23. For you see, though God understands the way to it and knows its home, we are not told the location of wisdom. Listen, we are not told the location of wisdom, but now, in this poem, our eyes are being directed to the one who alone does know, because he has set it in place. And in these remaining verses, they are, in a way, an early anticipation of how this book ends. If you know how Job ends, the voice of God comes with wisdom beyond man's understanding. And there is a very similar type of language and air about the words that finish Job 28. And that's because the poet now presses home his point by directing our wonder to one of the most uncontrollable things that we encounter in this world. And that is, in this created order, there is this weather that we have to endure. Weather. It's a daft thing to say, I know, but let me say it. We've had a lot of weather this week, haven't we? People say that. And we've known some aspects of extreme weather just in recent days. Well, look at these verses 25 to 27. Uncontrollable weather. Supercomputers, satellites, whatever you might say, we use to make sense of the world's weather systems. The weather remains unpredictable and uncontrollable. Extreme things break into our lives, and we can't stop it. They break into our ordered existence. They cause chaos. And yet, we are told, God gave to the wind its weight, and God proportioned out the waters by measure, and he made a decree for the rain and a way for lightning and thunder. God did. And he allowed these things, and does allow these things, to break into our world. And so, says the poet, when God ordered the weather systems of this world, he also set out and established his truths, his tested and approved wisdom, the good and the bad, in his plan, both together at the same time. And this wisdom then is presented to us as the centerpiece of his crown jewels, the utterly flawless and utterly priceless wisdom that he has given and to which he knows its place. He knows where it is found. And here is where the poem now does come to an end. Because verse 28 of this chapter is not the poet in the poem form. It appears to be a postscript to the poem. It's in a different style and meter. So this should be underlined after all that we've read so far. As the poem ends, it may be that our hopes now have been raised. For surely, if God knows the way to wisdom, then maybe he will take us there and he'll open our eyes so that we may know everything. And we'll all find all the answers to all our agonized questions. Our hopes are raised. But look at verse 28. No. No. That is still not the case. We are now to listen to the voice of not the poet so much, but God speaking. For in verse 28, he speaks for the first time in this whole book, since he first spoke in chapters 1 and 2. And here in this one verse, he speaks to human beings for the first time in the whole book. Take note then of what God says. It's a crucial saying that unlocks this whole book. For God now directs our attention, listen, away from our questions towards himself. He does not, therefore, take us by the hand and lead us to the answer. Rather, he beckons us to bow before the Lord himself, the one who knows all things, but yet who chooses not to tell us all things. That's hard, but that's what he does. And so, as one writer puts it, our eyes now are directed away from the search for the architecture of this world towards the person of the architect. He is the one we are to focus on. We ask, why doesn't God answer my question? To which he replies, turn your gaze and your inquiry away from the answer you want and turn towards the God you must obey. And we're not shown that if we want to live in this world as the wise and not as fools, then we're not to seek wisdom, not to seek it for our own sake, that is. In 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1, Paul even warns us that seeking for all knowledge and wisdom will only puff us up, make us proud, and make ourselves think that we are bigger than we really are. Really what this poet is saying, and I think what God adds as a postscript, is this, as hard as it may be to understand. Do not seek wisdom, seek me. Do not seek wisdom, seek the Lord. I think that's what we are told here. Now that is profound and it is deeply humbling, but also profoundly reassuring. Because if you were to turn back to the start of the book of Job, you would see a faithful, God-fearing man, seeking to please the Lord in all that he does, before calamity struck. Then we would understand that that is precisely how he should now continue to be. God takes us back to the start. Job sought me then, seek me now. But all this, seek me now. We are taken back to the start, to one who sought to please the Lord. We're being taught here not so much to ask why of God, but to say yes to God in all things. And as difficult and as troubling as that may be, we ought not to expect to find perfect answers and perfect wisdom in all that we may want to know in this life. We're shown that we should bow in humble worship before the one who does know all things. And we are told, therefore, to turn from evil and to seek him. So what does this interluding poem teach us? Before anything, it has surely caused us to stop in this world and to think in the middle of all the debates and arguments that whirl around us each and every day. We've been given cause to consider the biggest issues that anyone can ever find in this world. And in this book, and in this verse, chapter 28, verse 28 of chapter 28, we're given this divine affirmation. Job is given it and we're all given it. That there is no secret of the higher life, no mysterious spiritual law to raise us up to a deeper level of godliness. And there are no answers reserved only for the spiritually elite. We are called, as Job was, to begin our lives in discipleship and in the fear of God, and in repenting from evil. And then we're told to continue in that walk with God exactly the same way that we started it. This is what Job is being shown. This is what we need to hold on to. It's something that Paul commended to the church at Colossae. In fact, in Colossians 2, verse 2 and 3, he says, or he writes to the church there, that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And that ties in beautifully with chapter 28 of this book. Paul adds a couple of verses later. So then, just as you received Christ, continue to live your lives in him. That's the message of Job 28. So that you may be rooted and built up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. Dear friends, this is to be the search and the pursuit of each one of us. Even though we are to continue to live in difficult and testing days. To his praise and glory. Amen.